想出續集啫係嘛？
而且一路以嚟都係畫女人㗎啦。
有乜嘢啊？邊個？係咪新？我哋今個星期有 reading 啊嘛？
係啊嘛，啲人唔係有啲人，Mia 同埋嗰個。
Hi everybody. I see I'm late. I'm sorry. I was relying on the FSM clock up there. Whoops. So I apologize. I'm very pleased to see so many of you here. Our last week of class and after Thanksgiving break. I'm quite impressed. On Thursday, I would be handing out the final exam study guide. Oh, Jesus, yeah. And, no, I shouldn't name anything religious at the moment. Anyway, in vain. So I will be passing out the study guide and giving a review on Thursday. And then, sadly, I won't see you in this room anymore. You've been my comrades through trauma, so I'll miss you all. It's been a really terrible semester for all of highs and lows for all of you. But anyway, be strong. Think of me at Ohio State next week. Wow! Remember that? I was going there and I was so offended by the white supremacy posters I showed you, and now we already have a next step in what's happening to this country. So, here we are. All right, can we get the lights off? I know you're working on your papers. And I'm sure, let me once again say, it's helpful to have some fun. That actually might tell you you're on the right track if you're having some fun. If you're miserable, that doesn't mean you're on the wrong track. It's a hard paper, yet again, but it is also not one with an answer. It's one in which you show you're engaged with the problems. Okay. Anybody with questions? Waving that hand is a good question. Yeah. Okay. Well, today when I looked at my syllabus, as you know, over the weekend, and said, I can't make them read Deborah Silverman from the Belgian Congo. What was I thinking? As much as I love that essay, it's about Belgium. So I sent out an announcement that you no longer are reading that Silverman. You're still reading this. You've read Silverman on Van Gogh and Gauguin. The one time you were talking about Silverman, Jake, I was thinking you were talking about this Art Nouveau reading, but you were talking about her book on Van Gogh and Gauguin. So you're reading one part of that, and I looked back at my other syllabi and realized I had removed late photography from this class, so instead of spending time on the Belgian Congo, I'm going to insert not with any reading, some of the kind of strangeness of photography at the end of the century to add to our narrative that started so long ago with Bertillon and Solomon Godeau. But first, and my list isn't entirely right, I'm showing you Paul Signac's Breeze from 1891 that we've talked about at length. And, oh, don't yawn. What's that? Did you hear how loud that yawn was? I mean, if you do it pretty right. Cover up. You're here with no sleep, apparently. Is that right? No sleep. Okay. Well, in any case, I understand you might all be very pressed and stressed. But if you could keep your yawns to a lower decibel, it would help me not get too demoralized. Okay, we've been talking about the strangeness at the end of the century. That strangeness has gone a number of ways. That strangeness has gone the way of this follower of Seurat, this notion of a pointillist technique, right? That meaning those dots being deployed in a way that seems as much about the immaterial as the material, right? Rather than attempting to describe things, this seems like a dreamlike vision, as we've talked about at length, so we're not going to spend time on it. But I want to point out how weird and eerie a lot of the imagery has become at the end of this century. And partly that accompanies the incredible rejection of materialism, of a faith in science, positivism, engineering, progress, and some kind of retreat from that. That retreat, we know, for a Gauguin or a Cézanne is of a very different order than it is for the followers of Seurat. But they all share a way that they seem to need to leave the class conflict, the politics on the streets of Paris, right? Cézanne is still looking. He's still trying to describe what he sees, but he's needing to do it out in the countryside. Gauguin is imagining the visions of Tahitian girls with syphilis and Breton peasants. And Signac is turning what was an impressionist project of looking at the world, trying to capture what you see, not painting angels, as Courbet told us at the very beginning of this class. You can't paint what you don't see. That was Courbet's mandate. That was the avant-garde project, until we get into this moment of the 1880s and a variety of interests and things that are a little bit unreal as much as real. You see how it was built in, perhaps, into the Impressionist project's absolute faith in opticality. After all, Mallarmé taught you that light dissolves, that when you're capturing lighting effects, you're not necessarily capturing things, right? Things that you can hold. So for all of the sense of having faith in a kind of secular, scientific observation, faith in opticality, nonetheless, this Monet betrays that light and paint can conjure the material things of the world, but they don't necessarily actually claim to possess them, offer them up to the viewer. Rather, we see reflections in the sky. Okay. Well, this shift to one thing, as I've emphasized, one of the things that's important to say is this is also a shift not only from the material to potentially the immaterial, right? From a faith in science to a questioning about spirituality or psychological states, neurasthenia. Deborah Silverman will introduce some of this to you. But also a much more forthright embrace of the decorative, right? The decorative is going to very much be a kind of umbrella for so much of this late work. We might describe this Signac as decorative, meaning an emphasis on pattern rather than naturalism, an interest in the artificial. Long ago, I gave you Huysmans' Au Rebours, a quote on one of the handouts about the kind of aesthetic aristocrat whose pleasures are so much about a kind of densely affective world of pattern and ornament and luxury, as well as natural vines, right? Natural forms. So the decorative, and I hope you can see that I could ask a final exam question about the decorative that could show you this Signac, it could show you Gauguin, it could show you Vuillard, right? As well as this kind of, so this interest in pattern, a sense of a fecund, thick world of ornamentation. So different than the games Caillebotte would play. I don't think I've shown you this before. Interior Woman Reading, which is equally bizarre, right? Why is it bizarre? And you have to add these to your list. Yeah.
The proportions of the woman is so much bigger than me.
Yeah, it's fooling around with scale in the most extraordinary way. That little man on the sofa seems to be extending from her newspaper, right? But notice that Caillebotte's games, and notice it's in an ornamented bourgeois interior, still purport to be descriptive of that interior, and it are, you know, he's exploiting these optical effects, the ways in which scale can be surprising. And we're going to return to that when I introduce you a little bit more to the stereo view in photography, which you've read about in my book. Okay, so totally crazy, strange painting, Caillebotte's interior, but one that is still anchored in looking, right, as creating a kind of adequate substitute for what he saw in that interior, as opposed to the delight in the Vuillard, describing the kind of sheer confusion of pattern, ornament, the decorative, in muffling our ability to determine logical relationships in space. This is a relationship in space. It's whacked. But it is a relationship between two figures that you think inhabit the same room. And then you wonder, how far back is that sofa? Right? This one, you're not going to be able to unpack a kind of logic of spatial recession in the Vuillard. It's not the point. Okay, so the decorative is, I think, a thematic that matters a great deal at the end of the course, and notice how it pertains as well to Toulouse-Lautrec, right, with his posters. Their mass production, but nonetheless a sense of creating an artificial, stylized scene, set of scenes. Right? And the fact that you can buy a Toulouse-Lautrec poster for your room today, at the Printman, I would imagine, is part of that sense that it served as decor, and as Alex emphasized, both outside, but also ultimately could populate the inside. Alex.
Actually, one thing I forgot to say the other day is that this thing was called Postermania at the end of Paris. It was literally called Postermania, and people would go and steal posters off the walls.
For good reason, it costs a lot now.
They're putting us indoors, but already in the 1890s.
That's great.
They were really just taking
Already
them off the walls.
seizing them.
Yes.
Yeah, cheap painting. Okay, under the rubric again, under the umbrella of the decorative. Okay? Now, yeah, I meant to be showing you that. Now let me show you another triumph of the decorative at the end of the century, and that is to rely on Deborah Silverman's book Art Nouveau, which opens with a comparison of the Eiffel Tower built for the Universal Expo of '89 and the Universal Expo of 1900, only 11 years later. And she's explicit about the differences. For one thing, you need to know that this is the archway to enter the Universal Expo of 1900. And who is at the top but a gigantic figure called La Parisienne, the Parisian woman, right? So instead of that phallic, engineered, positivist, materialist study of forces and bending moments that allowed the Eiffel Tower to loom over the '89 Expo, now we have the return of the female. We have the return of the female, and indeed, and I don't have this in my notes, she is dressed in a fashion designer's robes. Do you remember which fashion designer, Alex? No. In other words, she's Renee. It is the fashionable woman come back with a vengeance. So we have Toulouse-Lautrec rejecting those Cheret posters, those Cherettes, those women who were wispy and rising up in his construction of these alternative singers and dancers in his posters. But we have that sense of the predominance, right? The predominance of the feminine in imagery that speaks a lot to this rejection of, it's a politics as well as an aesthetics that the Eiffel Tower stood for. Okay, and Silverman helps us. She points out that Art Nouveau in 1889, meaning just new art, was entirely different than Art Nouveau in 1900. That the new art in 1889 was an art of technology. It's not on the handout. Advanced industrial production. That it was associated with the liberalism of the Third Republic. That it was meant to glorify the Third Republic, the Eiffel Tower, as guardian and heir of the French Revolution of '89. That '89 was a celebration of the gallery of machines and the Eiffel Tower. Okay, and all of this speaking to a kind of youth, virility, confidence in engineering, in science, in materialism, and in democracy. Okay. It was part of a liberal credo of progress, part of republicanism. By 1900, she points out, traditional stone facades enclose the giant iron spaces. So this is the Gallery of Machines in '89, and this is how it's dressed up in 1900. It would have looked like an iron structure in '89. In 1900, suddenly you want to surround it with ornament, with stucco, with decoration, right? It becomes the Palace of Electricity and the Chateau of Water, right? And that sense that France was turning back to an old image of itself. It had come to feel inferior in terms of progress, in terms of industrialization, in terms of engineering, to Germany, England, United States. So what does France decide it can do? What can it do differently than anyone else? Elegance, rococo, refinement, expensive things, jewelry, high fashion, couture. A lot of the things you associate with France, most likely. The notion that if you want to be chic, buy French fashion, right? But if you want a beautiful gold vitrine, you can find it in France. At this point, they decide, let's celebrate not mass industrialization, not progress that is bound to iron and engineering and pragmatic, efficient use of materials. Let's realize what we can do is femininity, the decorative, right? The ornamental, the bejeweled, the fine materials of gold and silver, silk, brocade, right? And that's why this, only 11 years later, is dressed up like that, okay? So the 100-foot stone statue of La Parisienne, which is perched on those highly ornamented arches there, that entryway, is a reinvocation of traditional skills associated with the French 18th century skills. It's a retreat to ornamental fantasy. And I see that I give you a quote on your handout that has one terrible misspelling. It's under the Chateau d'Eau, and it's that long paragraph there about La Parisienne from Silverman. And I want you to go down halfway and see this sentence. The 1900 exhibit signaled a reinvocation of traditional overwrought masonry structures in the public domain and a retreat to ornamental fantasy in not an organized private interior. Correct me, it is organicized. See how spelling can really change everything? An interior defined as organic.
Organic.
Think that. Lushly, vertically organic interiors, right? Decorative, ornamental, but also organic. Curves, not iron structure. Okay. So this opposition of the Statue of Liberty and the Eiffel Tower in my book needs as its sequel Silverman's book, an argument about this. The weird way that the Statue of Liberty returns, metamorphosed into the ornamented La Parisienne instead of a personification of liberty, right? Instead of a personification of the Third Republic's commitment to democracy. This could be a sign of monarchy as much as democracy, right? Monarchy as much as a republic. This is what this building looked like at night. Light shooting out. Light as in what Villiers-sur-la-Dame so much loved, this sense of those immaterial forces like light, like sound, as much as material ones. Silverman also goes on to talk about the Goncourt brothers, and I can't spend much time here on that. But you need to know that they were key writers at the end of the century, and that they embraced the Rococo, right? They argued that it needed to be, that was the return. But they also associated the Rococo, the organic, the serpentine, the enmeshed, with our nervous system, with neurasthenia, described as physical exhaustion and mental hypersensitivity. We're talking about decadence here, partly, okay? And when Huysmans praises that weird aristocrat collector of fine art jewels ornamenting his weird space of things and organic shapes, etc., we're talking about an aesthetic that is partly about a sense of the aristocracies, but also potentially modern man's heightened nervous system, okay? A sense that you couldn't rely on logic, science, secular values. So this fixation on the nervous system by the Goncourt and others in the period should be seen as a corollary, as not entirely unlike Gauguin's love of finding hyper-emotional states in the primitive, who have visions, right? But one locates it in the primitive and one locates it in modernity, okay? But a modernity that seems bound very much to a kind of Rococo density. Extremity, excess would be words that would be associated with the Rococo. Okay. Questions? Read the Silverman, okay? It's like the sequel to my book. So we've thought about the decorative in painting, we've thought of the decorative in posters. Now you've been introduced to the decorative at the Universal Expo. But I want now to catch you up on photography. Oddly, it has some similar shifts. We started with Bertillon and his identity cards. Well, we started with Daguerre's Boulevard du Temple and the shoe shine scene, where some people disappeared. But we talked about Bertillon's cards as this incredible faith, right? That photography could be a record, that it could organize knowledge, that it was data, but data that would help you identify this huge immigrant population inside Paris. We talked about Alan Sikula's reading of the Bertillon project as a project that was not only with a remarkable faith in photography, but a remarkable faith in science, and a remarkable reliance on the archive, right? The assembly of so many photographs. But photography, as we know, is a weird medium. And I should have the Boulevard du Temple up here. I don't read Sikula right now. We should have the Boulevard du Temple there, because from its very beginning, photography was good at capturing the static, but the moving, the living could disappear, right? And it was a continual set of attempts to find a way to fix the world, pretending to a kind of fulsome description, when in fact it's always deceptive and limited photography. And we have a couple kinds of photographs that become really popular at the end of the century, and one of them I talk about in my book, and you might remember my discussion of the stereo view. Anyone remember anything to share? It was fairly technical, but I'm going to walk you through it a little bit. Izzy, do you remember anything? Not a thing. Okay, what is the stereo view? And in section tomorrow, I'm going to have you have glasses and stereo views to look at. Okay, well, as I tell you on your handout on the back, stereo views were very much celebrated by Oliver Wendell Holmes, an American jurist who was a great admirer of it. And these are two views. Let me just get basic. Can you tell me how this is made? Do you know what you're looking at all? Leo?
Two photographs, one slightly different, so two different images hit both eyes differently, so you kind of have a sense of 3D space.
That's fantastic. Okay, so a camera that has two lenses as far apart as your eyes. So that you know how when you sit in the bathtub and you look at your feet, and you open one eye, you close one eye, and the feet are over here, and then you close your other eye, and the feet are over here. Oh my God, it's the greatest thing from age 4 on, right? I still do it. Wow. Okay. We see the world from 2 points of view. We're bifurcated. Ding, ding, right? What if a camera actually captured the world in the same way by having two lenses? What they averaged was, I think, 2.5 inches apart. It's really wide to me, actually. But of course, some of us are more wide-eyed and close-eyed than others. George Bush, it was like 1/2 inch apart. But let's just generalize in the making of the camera and the stereo viewers. I'm really being so good, aren't I? I just am not talking about the election. I was thrown back to Bush. I feel fondly of that bastard. Okay, anyway, but I'm being so good. I'm being so good, so let's go back. Let's stay really technical and enjoy each other and enjoy intellectual pursuit. Let's enjoy having a vocabulary. Let's enjoy reading, knowing, learning, and not tweeting, right? Okay. So the stereo view shows us two views that are slightly different. Often it's hard to see, but here you might notice this just happens to be the Panama Canal, just happens. You see how this is intersected by the edge versus how this one is? Okay, that's the difference between the two views. All right? Then you put this, they make it into a stereo view, and you look at it through a viewing apparatus. And in the old days, they were entirely surrounding your face. And it would allow you to put the stereo view in, and you could move it back and forth until it resolved into a single image. Okay? And that single image seemed dimensional. Did any of you grow up with those little red Viewmasters? Like when you went to Grand Canyon? And okay, this is the history of the Viewmaster. Okay, that sense of, whoa! Dimensionality in a photograph. But is it still a photograph when you see it through the viewing device? It's not that surface, it's not that picture, right? It starts to be an immersion. Now, nothing like today's promise of being able to sit on your couch and get fat and travel everywhere and those damn things they're inventing. But close to it, early on, what Holmes says in that quote on the back is that he now could travel to ancient Egypt sitting on his couch, essentially, right? So they provided information. But one of the things I want to focus on today, because I'm talking about this weird moment at the end of the century, where different technological devices are as eerily dematerializing as they are materializing. So Holmes describes this as solids, viewing solids. And as I argue in my book, and you better go back and read that section, I argue that it is not about seeing solids, as you'll see tomorrow. What it's about seeing, and you might remember that from your ViewMasters, your little red machines, it's about seeing flats. So one flat that seems closer to you and another flat that seems further back. You don't tend to see them as dimensional solids. You see the gap in space between the flats. What they're really good at conjuring is the space between, not the things themselves. So when you see a person in a stereo view, and I show you some in my book, that person will look a little dimensional on the back, but you feel like there's nothing in his front, right? It's as though he's a flat where you have some dimensionality, but then it's a gap to the next space, right? And in the stereo view, this rubble will look so cool. Things in the foreground look incredibly acute, detailed. And then there's a gap, and then there's a kind of not very deep shed, and then there's a gap, and some more grass. Okay, so it's about intervals, and it's about space. Does that remind you of anything? Okay? Flats and emptiness. Flats and emptiness. Okay? With all of what's sort of surreal about focusing on the space in between instead of the thing itself. Okay? Well, I talk a lot about stereo views, and I think I do some of the best work that's ever been done on stereo views, and I've been told that. But I was actually interested in it in relationship to the Panama Canal and the use of stereo views at the time to celebrate that. Here's the guy who could look somewhat dimensional here, but like no sense that he has another side. It does feel like stills. I go on so far, and you're going to have to, I can't spend the time today because I want to get to Muybridge and Murray. I can't go on at great length. But I talk about the difference between, between how we see things without a device, okay, and how we see things in a photograph that's flat, and how we see things in a stereo view, and how they accommodate different kinds of perception. Okay, so this is like Seurat land. It's like science, right? It's perceptual. But it's perception, it heightens our awareness of how weird perception is. So I say that looking at that single photograph of this man makes the distance look really far away and really small. Okay? While when you look at people yourself, you do all sorts of accommodations. So this is about size constancy. Don't look at that. Look at this. Here's a photograph. And it's trying to show you that when you look at this picture, you believe that far woman is pretty similar in scale to the woman in the foreground, because you know she is. But if you actually cut her out and see her as a surface, look how teeny she is. Does it remind you of Kaya Butt's Interior? Right? Kind of showing you the mechanism of looking, where we do all sorts of compensations in real life so that I don't see you auditors as this big at the back. They are teeny compared to Leo. Leo's a giant up here compared to them. But I look back and I see you as all comparable in height. I compensate. It's when you become aware of the surface of the picture. Oh God, I screwed up here. So complicated. It's when you become aware of the surface of the picture that you might be able to think, what size is she actually? But even the photograph deceives you, and you believe she's a lot bigger there, even though she's small here. In real life, when we look, we don't see distant things as small as they are. That's what I'm trying to say. We compensate through size constancy by saying, that tree back there is like this tree up here. It's closer than I think, than I actually see. Not than I think, okay? I think they're similar in size, but what I actually see is a tree this big and a tree as tall as this ceiling. But when I see it out there in the world, I don't see how teeny I'm seeing that distant tree, okay? Why does this matter? Let me see if I can make it work. Here is a stereo view. You put it in a viewer and you're approximating actual vision. You compensate when you look through it so that the far things, when you're looking through it in a stereo view, do not look as small. Okay? It doesn't give you distance, a remarkable sense of distance, in the same way that a photograph might. Okay? Because you do that compensatory work of size constancy, maintaining that. What a stereo view does, however, what did I just tell you stereo views do? And Anya, Izzy?
Approximate seeing.
Approximate seeing, Izzy?
Yeah, make it three-dimensional.
Makes things three-dimensional, kinda. What did I emphasize? Don't tell me. Tim?
Interval.
Interval. What did I say was about that interval? What occupies that interval? Space.
Flat.
Yeah, the gap, the space between things. So what this stereo view does is it doesn't show you the distance of the Panama Canal, great excavation, so much as it shows you the gap between, and this is why they put him here, the gap between this guy and that. Space, which in this picture is depth, which is what the canal is about. Okay? It's extraordinarily effective at showing what the excavation of a hole is like. Do you get it? Right? So I'm saying it's not so great at solids, but it's really good at holes, gaps in the foreground, but depth. It really conjures that, like, oh my God, he's on a precipice and all right? Yeah,
Was this the kind of thing where you could have like a machine at home and put these in? Or?
absolutely.
Okay, so that's
You
what
bought
the
them.
intended audience.
Yeah, these would be in schools, whole sets on ancient Egypt, Panama Canal, Suez Canal, later Mount Rushmore, blah, blah, right? The salesman went around and sold it to libraries and schools, but if you had the money, you could also buy whole sets for yourself, and you can still do so on eBay. Okay? You can get on there and buy a 1900 viewer, and then you can buy some set of stereo views on a particular subject, or one at a time. Okay? Good Christmas present. I'm just hiking up the price of my own collecting sources. Okay, so this challenge in photography was a challenge to describe colossal scale. Okay? And as I say, it was particularly good at depth and not as great at distance because of the size constancy effect. But you know what? Stereo views aren't great at showing huge things. Why aren't they great at showing huge things? Well, because our eyes are only 2.5 inches apart. We don't see two sides of a colossal monument adequately. A colossal monument would require eyes 5 feet apart to see that other side of the Statue of Liberty and that side of the Statue of Liberty. Do you see? So they sometimes spread the lenses and made views of the colossal. But then Holmes and others said, oh God, still doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Well, it shows the dimensionality of the Statue of Liberty or the Colossus of Ramses or whatever. But guess what it looks like in a stereo view? It looks like a small model. Because you see it as though your eyes would have seen it that way. So you don't sustain the sense of scale. Do you get what I just did? Okay? So if you want dimensionality of the colossal thing, we look at it and we say, oh, it's how we would see the dimensionality of something, so it must be 6 inches tall. Not 100 feet, not 1,000 feet tall. Got it? So there was this sense of, oh, this is such a good illusionistic effect, but it was an illusionistic effect that miniaturized. Okay? I'm trying to point out from the very beginning of the class, I've been emphasizing that photography always has certain capacities and certain incapacities. Okay? So here is a whole new technological invention, and it still can't do everything. Right? If it's going to show colossal scale, it's going to make you think you're looking at a little toy model from the Universal Expo, not the thing itself. It could give you a precipitous sense of depth, but it may not show you the scale of the adventure altogether into the distance, for instance. These guys help, right? They help you see it in terms of scale. But I'm just saying, even a stereo view offers this weird, altered, partial substitute for reality that we know in multiple ways. Yeah, you had a question.
I was actually just going to ask, like Bartoli tried to use the human as scale to show.
Absolutely.
So I was going to ask if that helps.
That does help a great deal. They try. It still can look like a couple guys standing in the foreground in a miniature pyramid way back there. Okay. So stereo views are weird. Learn about it. Okay? I want you to be able to write about it. And I give you, like, that way I give you my book on the back with things in bold per paragraph, okay? Don't tell me you can't figure it out. You see? It's called a cheat sheet. It's called me infantilizing you. It's called me trying to get you to care. All right. You do care. I trust you to care. Well, what were other photographic projects from the end of the century? We're looking, as you see, at Muybridge. You know about Muybridge down at Stanford? So as I tell you, he was British born, but worked in the US at Stanford. And he produces this amazing book, Animal Locomotion, an electrophotographic investigation of consecutive phases of animal movements in 1887. 11 volumes, 781 plates, 561 of them are of humans, which I didn't put in here and I should have. Okay. It's commissioned in 72 and completed in 85, this project. I cannot tell you how long Europeans, and I guess Americans too, have wondered how a horse gallops. And whether there's ever a moment when the horse has no foot on the ground. This goes back to Jericho at the beginning of the 19th century in France. British horse painters showing them flying with all their legs off the ground. What's the answer? Muybridge teaches us. Is there ever a moment in any of these where the horse has no hoof on the ground? Yeah. Guess what? They do that. Glad they worked that out. Okay. Now, how did Muybridge do this? Multiple cameras with shutter triggers. The quote is underneath all of the photographers. let's just begin with the first sentence. Whereas Muybridge, using multiple cameras with tripwire electrical shutters, had succeeded in decomposing motion into space, his frozen images fell short of what Marais, the man we're focusing on today, the French photographer, wanted to achieve, which he wanted to achieve, the decomposition of motion into time. Boy, I'm really messing with you, right? We're entering the 20th century. We haven't even gotten to Einstein, but I bet a bunch of you, it's like your head hurts. Let's look at it. So this is a whole series of cameras that produces still. But Marais is not going to want to have the kind of arbitrariness of the intervals between those shots. He wants to describe the entire trajectory of motion. Okay? So here we see the zoetrope, the device that relies on the persistence of vision. So now you have size constancy as something you need to know about. And here's the persistence of vision, which makes the horse appear to gallop as you spin the device, right? And notice how we're in the world of toys. We're also in the world of cinema, pre-cinematic, right? So I'm leading you right up to that cusp and abandoning you to learn the rest. Oh, I do have Muybridge's figures. Man throwing ball with a grid behind him to act as though it's scientific. And if you believe it, lifting 75-pound stone on shoulder. There is a lot of gaps of information here. He's squatting twice, then suddenly he's quite a bit up, then he's fully up, then he's like fallen over. And we have that sense that this is very partial information if it's about studying this procedure. If you think that's true, check out women. They're even more fantastical. So, woman dancing. Oh my God, why doesn't she have a top on? Right? Woman dancing. Do we believe we've learned anything from this study other than we can have like more soft porn instead of less? Right? And you know, yeah, go ahead.
What was his point? Like,
What was his point? Yeah. The pretense here is to a scientific analysis. But there's nothing like gender to completely reveal the kinds of constructions being done here. The men are carrying things, the women are doing some kind of dance. If you don't know what that dance is, what are you learning about the shift in position from one to another? Two models, one standing, the other sitting, crossing legs. Uh-huh. Learning a lot here. Oh, God. Okay. Muybridge pretends to be a scientist. He's a fabricator. Marais really comes from a scientific point of view. And I tell you a little bit about him at the bottom. I say Marais was significant in the development of cardiology, physical instrumentation, aviation, cinematography, and the science of labor photography. And we'll get to more in a second. So he begins with things like this. This is Marais. His sphygmograph, a device to produce a continuous graphic representation of the pulse. The registration unit at the upper right shows the blood pressure waveforms obtained from the set of levers at the wrist. So we're looking not at a photograph, but we're looking at a transcription device, which is his impulse. His impulse is as a scientist. He wants to figure out ways to turn physiological conditions into images that tell us something. Don't just represent us performing as models for Muybridge that tell us things like like how the pulse functions, okay? And he's the man who does these pictures. Have you seen them as postcards here and there? Here, a high long jump by Monsieur. Murray had the walls and ceiling of a hangar hung with black velvet so that he could isolate the figure, and he is relying on a single camera. That single camera, which has a device for repeated opening of the shutter, registers on a single plate this movement. It has a more scientific sense of interval, not like the woman crossed her legs, then I gave her coffee and tea, and then I asked her to uncross them. In the Muybridge, you have no sense of the correlation of temporal moments with the different pictures shown. This one, you're really seeing what every few seconds is registered by this man jumping. Do you get the difference? If you have a bunch of cameras, you don't know that they correlate. You don't know if the shutter moment of each is like 10 seconds between camera 1 and camera 2, but only 3 seconds between camera 2 and camera 3, do you see? But to have the same camera with this systematic attempt to describe motion, you get more information about the nature of motion. I want to point out that this has been a lecture partially about the decorative, ornamentation, but also, oddly, about interval, about space, about emptiness, right? I think Signac's The Breeze is interesting in relationship to this too, right? So if it's interesting in relationship to the flats of a stereo view, it's also interesting in the sense of what repetition within a single image does. Now these guys are unlike each other, but it is still that interest in the serial at some level. Well, the impulse here is to describe as much continuous motion as possible. And by the way, as I tell you, this is partly a response to the defeat of the French in the Franco-Prussian War. Remember that war? And the sense that French soldiers were not fit, okay? That they were really miserable compared to German, Prussian soldiers, right? Too weak. Remember that this race, according to Zola, was degenerating. You can't put a Maxime out at the front, they're saying. We can't have our degenerate youth out there fighting. We've got to understand what would be the most systematic way of training soldiers to be fit. So let's get athletes in here and study their motion. It's another weird crisis of masculinity manifest here. Okay, crisis of masculinity partly when we see a return to the female, the feminine, the interior, the domestic, the decorative. But also a crisis of masculinity when you are so preoccupied with trying to understand how to constitute a masculine French a French masculinity. Okay? Well, he's naked too. What's interesting about this picture? Yeah, is he?
He's in profile.
Louder. He's in profile.
Yeah.
What else? Yeah, Alec.
There are moments of like overlapping.
Thank you. He's in profile. We're seeing him stride. But as you capture each stride, you lose information where he overlaps. Do you see that? So, like feet overlapping. So while you're getting some information about what the stride is like, you're losing other information. right? And the kind of merging that motion studies so often entails. We're looking at Muybridge and Murray. And you see how separate shutters keeps the figures distinct, while having the figure together on one plate creates this kind of what we might call blurring, overlapping, right? And it'll become more so. The more you finesse this description, compressing the interval between each picture, right? The more information you get, the more likely you're going to obscure some of the information with overlaps. Because you have one plate, as opposed to showing each of these views on separate plates. But showing them on one plate does give you confidence that you are seeing a consistent continuum temporally. Time. Okay?
Professor,
Yeah.
like what kind of information did they get out of those?
What the hell? Good question.
This is like supposed to be a study about actually.
Yeah, it's emotion studies. He's got a lab, like Edison. A lab in which these are, a scientific inquiry that's being funded because of the sense that you might better understand motion, but also efficient movement. And those of you who know U.S. history, you might know Taylorism, and a sense that industrialization drew attention to how you could make workers do the most efficient movements, right, on an assembly line or whatever. So it's all within that kind of discourse. How you would actually use these? No idea. Okay, so I'm showing you the problem. They're gorgeous. Aren't they gorgeous? But they're nuts. If Ferris wanted to know how the hell these are helpful, how the hell is this helpful? This is beginning to become illegible. Again, photography, for all its claims to be able to register, record data, and here scientifically, where the time intervals are discrete, for all of that kind of emphasis, the actual single image, we could argue, is completely unhelpful or inadequate. So what does he have to invent? Well, of course he has to invent a gun. This is the chronophotographic rifle camera. What do you have to do when science and progress seem to elude you? You invent a gun, even in France. The barrel of this rifle is a tube that contains a photographic lens, Murray explained. At the back, firmly attached to the butt, there is a broad cylindrical breech containing a clockwork. When one presses the trigger of the gun, the clockwork starts, setting into motion the various pieces of the device. A central axis, making 12 revolutions per second, drives all the parts of the contraption. The most important of these parts is an opaque disc pierced by a narrow window. This disc works as a shutter and only lets the light from the lens through 12 times per second for 1/720th of a second each time. There was a photographic plate behind the shutter, either circular or octagonal, which rotated jerkily but regularly. 12 images were successively imprinted on the periphery of the plate. What does this remind you of? Photosculpture. Okay, this claim to a simultaneity. Well, actually, that's different, right? Let's get precise here. This one is a temporal lag, but a temporal lag that has a kind of complete circle. Photosculpture was a simultaneous click of the shutter that claimed to capture everything three-dimensionally. Okay? So what is this camera going to do? How would this help? Well, you realize part of the problem back here I know, it's so great, isn't it? Part of the problem here was too much information. You know, we don't need his kneecap up there with the folded tights and his knees, the pucker. We don't need every part of his chest. We've got to find discrete units to describe, he decides. So what does that entail? It entails a man with a gun and a man in a black suit, where only this light white will be visible here. Cool, man. Motion studies. A geometric chronophotograph of a man running in a black suit with white stripes, 1882. Where are we? Is this, Jeremy says, I don't know. Where are we? Is this materialism? Or is this symbolism, the belief in the immaterial, the spiritual? Right? This is science that has created the most abstracted representation of something that is not about the physical limits of a person, their contour, their weight, their mass, their volume, but has, isn't it extraordinary, has reduced the head to a white dot. Right? The shoulder to a white dot. The feet apparently need more information, according to him. And we still see the problem of overlap in the feet. But you notice that now the body doesn't overlap any longer, right? There is a discreteness to this registration. But at the cost of what? Here's something that gives you a sense of what it was like for this guy to run in a black outfit. This is in between this and the picture you just saw. Bird in flight. An attempt to register movement. This is the world of Edison in V.A. sur l'Isle-Adam's novel at some level. It's this weird world where you're trying to imagine a way to register life in a inanimate transcription, whether it be graphing or photographing. Yeah.
Were these programs backed by the government?
Can I remember that? I think he does have government support. I'll have to double check for you and tell you on Thursday. Yeah. So this is scientific analysis. This is the world Seurat would believe in. It's also the 1880s. And yet, the outcome of this search in photography for a kind of increased accuracy, objectivity, veracity to the world creates this dematerialized sense of motion and time, kind of in ways that exceed the human figure, right? So there's a kind of disappearing act here at some level. Even as it attempts to capture more, it captures less, right? Photography. So I didn't assign any reading on Mareg, and I could have, but I'm not going to. But I want you to have this kind of sense of where we leave photography at the end of this century, and also the extent to which this does announce cinema. Okay? The invention of the moving picture. bringing together of a bunch of stills that together produce a kind of animation. What's unique to the Marais is the fact that it's an attempt to have that animation on in a single image, right? Yeah, Alec.
I was gonna say, because obviously with these geometric kind of photographs, there's, I guess, a suppression of the body, like Sadlowski's writes about Vuillard's.
Absolutely.
Why do you think that it reemerged in cinema with the actual body then?
Such a nice question. Well, it's not initially, I mean, think of the early picture of the train, the early cinematic productions that were not of the human body, but of these mechanistic devices that you could capture and that scared the shit out of you when you saw them in some kind of continuum, right? People screaming about the train coming at them in these short clips. Such a nice question about the return of the body, but it's a cinematic body, right?
Yeah.
It's a body that is as much a kind of flickering illusion as we might think bodies appear in these, but also the stereo views, but also that sense of, even in a Vuillard, not having access to an entirety that is a physical entity, right? It's not, you don't, in a Vuillard, you don't have access to a unified body. You have glimpses of parts that seem at some level to have the same status as wallpaper, flowers, pattern. Now, I haven't taught you symbolism full throttle. Look up Gustave Moreau and Odile Redon, and you won't be surprised that I just can't stand the stuff. And that I'd rather teach you immateriality in Marais than immateriality in this, like, heavy metal record cover kind of shit. I have a grad student I adore who wrote a really good dissertation on symbolism, and she made the class so excited in 2014. But she's not here, and Alex, you won't tell her. She knew, I told her. I can't stand this stuff. You can't stand it. Singing in the rain. All right, any questions? I think you can go finish the papers. And remember, come Thursday, final